if you both would like, I know it's a small group, we can get started. You know, if you all need to head out or something, I don't mind it being a 15-minute reading, 30, or whatever you all want. This is supposed to be fun, So
Yes. So
so okay.
I already see a grow citation and a footnote.
Ah, right, right.
Oh,
And it's interesting with Guerrero, I mentioned this last time, was that in Guerrero's early career, in his early academic career, he mainly theorized about Leibniz, and then later he theorized about Spinoza. And I was telling people here last time that Deleuze was kind of the opposite, right? Like he started more with Spinoza, and then he transitioned to Leibniz, and he's still drawing from Guerrero. So um, Guerrero has a huge influence, and I'm really sad that a lot of it's not translated. Like his essays on Leibniz aren't translated into English. So so I'm sure
yeah.
he gives Leibniz the same treatment that he does to kind of Spinoza.
Yes, it's pretty limited to to someone like me who doesn't speak French when it comes to grow. And it's just one of the things. I don't really when it comes to Spinoza, I do think that my reading might be a bit more classical, but I I'm kind of split, honestly. It's between Thoreau's more heterodox view of substance and all that
Yeah, very,
stuff. It's
very, very, very interesting, and that's kind of what I think Deleuze is also talking about. Because even though he takes Guerrero's view of Spinoza in A Thousand Plateaus, especially, um, I think Deleuze is still dealing with this problem of individuation a little bit. How can you individuate one body without organs from another body without organisms, or this from that? Like, what is that thing that allows for individuation? And can you solve that, or is he still relying on the primacy of something like a one or a substance? And that's where he comes to Leibniz. So I think this is actually a good starting point. I took a couple notes last time, and just kind of excited to dig into this. So thank everyone. I thank everyone for coming here right now. What we saw last week was that Deleuze is discussing the Baroque not as just a simple art style or architectural moment or period in time, but rather a way of thinking about reality, specifically the Baroque being that of an operation. So we're still in chapter one. We've only read like 5 pages. So with Deleuze, either you missed a lot, or he's still setting the foundation. But I think that there's a solid foundation he's starting to set that we'll also see today about how the Baroque is that operation of folding. When you look at architecture of the Baroque period, art, or even, I like to joke, Leibniz's own hair, there's a lot of folding happening. And whether you're looking at strict inorganic matter, organisms in a biological, sense, not in a previous sense that maybe Deleuze talked about, the soul, or even how each monad has its own unique perspective of the world. We're all talking about, and we're only talking about folding here. What we also saw was that he tries to use the architectural style of the house, the Baroque house, to show that there's two floors. The top floor is going to be the monads that have maybe more of a clear perception of the world. And he talks about the soul being an example of that. So maybe the Noah monad has more clarity than a rock monad, or something along those lines, or even some animal monads. And then at the lower floor, this is where he's also talking about inorganic matter. So what we're seeing with Deleuze's view of the Baroque house is you have those two floors, and there is always this level of communication between them. The top floor is not separate from the bottom floor, and vice versa. So as we're talking about this, he's also bringing in a little bit of math, and we're going to see that more. So I'm hoping some other people are also decent at math here, because it's a bit tricky with what he's doing. But he's talking about how, given that each monad has its own perspective of the entire universe, the universe itself is an infinite curvature, defined by inflections, continuous and constant inflections. So we're going to kind of see how in this next section what he's even talking about with folding and how he's going to kind of move on to then explain and talk more about the monad. One thing is we're kind of starting in the middle of analysis. I just wanted to bring up really quickly before I read this paragraph here that he specifically isolates that there are three consequences pertaining to matter. There are three consequences pertaining. The first is that matter is fluid. It's not completely in a highly divisible or infinitely divisible straight line. It operates through curvature and bumping into other things in a fluid manner. The second consequence of his analysis is that there is this level of elasticity. So when he's talking about elastic matter, he's talking about how matter can be stretched and then go back into its same spot. So I like to think about maybe skin, for example, like on one's arm. You can kind of pull it and then release it and it goes back. So the first kind of consequence of Deleuze's matter here is that it's fluid. The second is that there's some elasticity. It doesn't just fall apart and break apart. Matter is, elastic. And then lastly, he describes it like a spring where there is a storing and releasing of a force through compression and expansion. So he brings up this view of matter, and this is only 5 pages in, and he's talking about the elasticity, fluidity, and the spring of matter. This is mainly a large attack of a Cartesian model of philosophy, viewing matter as something maybe infinitely divisible, strict points in a line that can be fundamentally separated from one another. Deleuze is, of course, we've seen from earlier work, he's talking about one substance. He's going to be against this kind of Cartesian model. But with Leibniz, we're now talking about an infinite number of monads and substances. And what does that look like for them to be elastic and fluid? One example that he gives that I really like is that matter is not fully hard or fully fluid in the sense that it's not forming anything at all. And he gives the example of, imagine you're on a boat in water, and in order for you to float, there needs to be some level of fluidity. It can't just be fully indeterminate. But then if you go really, really fast on a boat, you can hit water and it can feel like hitting a brick wall. So he's trying to get at matter is not fully hard, and it's not fully indeterminate and fluid to the point where it doesn't allow for any formation. It's always oscillating between these kind of these 2 points, I guess you could say. And it's also about perspective. Like we said, water can be like that of a brick wall if you hit it, or it can be something that, you float on. And Patina wrote, yes, this is very rubbery like topology with the elasticity bit, of course, right? And I think that's really, really the crux of what he's going to be getting at with matter. All right. With that being said, let's talk about the fabric that is reality. And we're going to sum up his point that he said. This kind of paragraph sums up his earlier point. So let's go into it. And welcome everyone else for joining. Thanks so much for being here. Thus, the lower floor is also made up of organic matter. An organism is defined by endogenous folds, whereas inorganic matter has exogenous folds that are always determined from without, or by the surrounding environment. Hence, in the case of the living being, there is an internal formative fold that is transformed with the evolution and development of the organism, once the necessity of a preformation. Yet organic matter is not different from inorganic matter, and the distinction between primary and secondary matter, I'm on my PDF, and the distinction between primary and secondary matter is not at issue here. Whether inorganic or organic, it is the same matter, but it is not the same active forces that are exerted on it. To be sure, these forces are perfectly material or mechanical, and there is not yet any place for souls to intervene. For the moment, vitalism is a strict organicism, What accounts for the organic fold are material forces that must be distinguished from the preceding forces, adding to them, and which are sufficient, whenever they are exerted, to turn unique matter into an organic matter. Leibniz calls them plastic forces, which must be distinguished from compressive or elastic forces. They organize masses, but although masses prepare for or make possible organisms by means of springs, one can never go from masses to organisms, since organs always presuppose these plastic forces that preform them, which are distinguished from forces of mass to the point where every organ is born from a pre-existing organ. Even the fossils in matter are not explained by our faculty of imagination, as when we see Christ's head in the stains on a wall, but refer to the plastic forces that pass through already existing organisms. Okay, we have a lot going on here. I don't think I see any particular... Oh, I do see a footnote here. Let's just check it out. 16, letter to Lady Masham, and considerations of the principles of life are immaterial, but plastic faculties are not. Okay, so he's just kind of citing, it looks like this might be a letter that Leibniz wrote. Like I said last time as well, the footnotes I noticed in this text, unlike some other ones, are mainly just kind of references. There's not like a ton of analysis. Very rarely he'll kind of go in depth with his own argument, from what I've read so far. So when we're looking at this section here, I want to just make sure... I can't really show both pages. I guess I probably can on the PDF. But regardless, he's making a distinction here between exogenous and endogenous folds. I'm curious if anyone has any idea about that relationship or why maybe that distinction is being made. So sort of what I'm asking or thinking is, what is the change here when a fold is determined from the outside or surrounding environment versus when it sort of comes from within? That's kind of how I'm reading this. So any kind of ideas there?
Perhaps just maybe a distinction between activity and passivity. Right? This is somewhere along those lines.
Yeah, totally.
Yes.
What do you mean there? Are you saying like, and are you saying exogenous might be more active or endogenous might be more passive or vice versa?
The vice versa, I'd say endogenous being probably the more actively conceived forces compared to the exogenous, which once again I'm coming at this from a very outside angle alignment, so I'm not too sure if these the way I'm using these terms are really accurate or precise. Alignment does, but
I mean, I think that makes some sense to me, and I think that this text is hard enough. So please, I think that you definitely should be bringing your own ideas, and we can come to conclusions. And I think what you're saying is interesting to me. It kind of reminds me of, I believe Roger mentioned this like a couple of years ago, but I'll use that example. It reminds me of almost like a hermit crab, where you have a crab in relation to a shell, and then the shell in relation to the crab, where you have almost these different kinds of matter. In this case, you have the organic, vitality, one could say, of this crab, and there's a force there. We're talking about maybe an endogenous force coming from within. But then at the same time, there is another force when waves are crashing, or the ocean floor is changing, or a shell hits, or a rock hits, a crab or something, or an organism. And then they then use that shell in a way as that kind of outside force. But it's not like one is imposed upon the other. I'm not thinking to myself, and I think what Rise Noza was saying, and you can also correct me if I'm wrong, it's not as though the organism is a priori taking the outside environment and exerting a force on it. It's instead that both are occurring simultaneously. Is that with the organic matter and the inorganic, they are kind of co-producing each other in a in a way, but I could be reading that wrong here. Oh, yeah. I don't know, Rise knows if you're going to say something, but please feel free to cut me off.
No, I'm just thinking.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So that's kind of one reading I'm kind of seeing here. But then what I also notice here is Deleuze is also bringing into account plastic forces. So we're not just dealing with elasticity. And this is getting kind of weird now. When we looked at elastic forces, we looked at matter that is able to be stretched and then goes back into place. But when we're looking at plastic forces, we're looking at matter that is now stretched and can tear apart, which is kind of different, of course. So what we saw earlier last week was that TLDR, Deleuze, quick summary, Deleuze talks about matter as fluid, elastic, and spring. There's a fluidity to matter, it's elastic and spring-like through via forces of compression and forgetting the other word. But why is that view of matter not enough to describe living organisms? So like Deleuze is now having to introduce another level. Like reality maybe could be a lot easier explained if there wasn't necessarily organic matter. But the fact is that there is. So why does he have to introduce plastic forces? It's kind of a question to think about. But in the meantime, I think Patina has a comment here. Uh, Patina wrote, with the hermit crab example, I'm thinking about how the shell is its world, and the crab itself is like a subject, and they are in a way co-constitutive. And this is where I hear what you're saying, and I think that this is where it gets a little tricky because you can't necessarily. I know it's kind of weird to say you can't have one without the other, but how is that subjectivity even produced in the first place? It's produced in relation to the environment. With that anti-Cartesian view of matter, or that anti-Cartesian view in general. Deleuze is not saying that the subject is then divorced from nature and then uses nature as an external world around it. It's that these things are co-produced completely. So he's almost getting rid of that subject object divide, i.e., there is a hermit crab and there's a shell. It's that both of these things are interrelated. And he's making that larger argument throughout his philosophy. But then at the same time, look at what he's doing. He now has to make a distinction between the organicism, right, the organic matter versus the inorganic. And this is where it can get. I think this is where Deleuze has to be very, clear here that we can make these distinctions, but then there's still this dissolution of the subject-object divide here. So, yeah, very, very, very interesting point here. However, when we go back to the plastic forces, I'm just curious if there are any other thoughts about why fluidity, elasticity, and springs is just not enough to explain it. Like, what about plastic forces here is
Well,
unique?
um, what I'm thinking of when he's saying plastic forces is the way in which Deleuze in his other works would speak of like a plastic principle, which is a principle in philosophy that conditions something, but all simultaneously is generated by what it conditions, or is at
Mm.
least determined by what it conditions. It's in that mutual relationship. So I think that maybe the plastic forces, in a sense, if we understand them as working almost akin to this, the whole reason why he's using the term plastic here, then maybe they could account for their own genesis in this way, and
Mm.
thus we could look at them more actively, um, rather than passively, is the way I would crudely put it.
Yeah, I mean, I totally see what you're saying. Maybe my view of plastic forces is a bit reductive. I think that maybe I mean that kind of does make sense. Like when we're looking at organic matter, there is definitely a difference here, and that might be about the
Mhm.
level of force. When we look at quote unquote compressive or elastic forces, maybe the idea here is a higher level of maybe rigidity per
Mhm.
se. Is that maybe part of it? I mean, he says it's compressed there, compressive or elastic forces. So, I mean, the opposite of that would be trying to find the word. I think I took a note. Hold on one second. Yeah, no, I guess maybe I didn't because I thought there was another word for the opposite of like. I guess the opposite would just be expansion. Like maybe that's the word that I'm thinking about. Like you have the
Like,
compression of an
mhm,
elastic force.
like a dilation, perhaps.
Maybe, but then you have the compression and then you have the expansion of it. So like a spring, you push down on it and then you let go and it jumps
Mhm.
out. And that seems to be how he's kind of describing elasticity. But I'm noticing here though he's describing it purely in terms of compressive. So I'm wondering if there's something about plastic forces that has a level of expansion as well, because I just feel like he's not able to fully say that they are completely different. I mean, we're looking at two forms of matter here, but at the end of the day, it's still matter. So it seems like there's still some level of compressiveness in plastic forces as well as expansion in elastic forces. But maybe he's trying to say that these two kinds of matter lean more one way, if that makes sense.
Yes, I I know the angle I kind of took with plastic forces kind of positioned, at least made it to where Leibniz was kind of was going far beyond his own time, already accounting for both synthesis and genesis. Just something Kant couldn't even adequately do. But
Yeah, no, fair enough. I mean, but I mean, I guess that's also trying to see if a philosophy holds, right? Like, does this hold or does this not make sense? I mean, so
yeah,
I'm
I
glad. I'm glad. What I'm saying is, I'm glad you're bringing up, you know, those kinds of comments as well.
yeah. Deleuze does like to do that, where he'll take a past philosopher and he'll just kind of uh, uh, make look at the philosopher from a particular angle that hasn't been done before exactly, or at least not elucidated like he does, and make instantly do away with a lot of criticisms that maybe came from German idealism or something like that. Like he does that with Spinoza as well in
I mean,
expressionism.
and then now we're doing that to
Right?
this book, right? So now we're not
Yes.
adding our, yeah. No, I love it. I love it. That's why we that's why we do it. Maybe some of the answer to the question, what we could do to solve this problem, is we could maybe look at the last sentence. He says, and I'll read it again: even the fossils in matter are not explained by our faculty of imagination, as when we see Christ's head in the stains on a wall, but refer to the plastic forces that pass through already existing organisms. So, of course, there's that little jab here at transcendence. Um, Maybe it's even referring to the face of Christ coming earlier in like a thousand plateaus, whatever it may be. When you look at a wall, you might be able to make out a face of Jesus and be like, oh, that's a sign. That's a sign of some kind. I'm curious if anyone has any ideas or thoughts about what he's saying in terms of like the plastic forces in fossils here, like dinosaur bones could be something we look at, or anthropology, like earlier human societies. So I'm kind of curious, why are the fossils in matter not explained by the faculty of imagination, and how does that relate to plasticity? Also, apologies in advance. I live in like a very, very urban city. I'm currently in San Francisco, so I do apologize if there's like just sounds in the background. I also have a cat here, so a lot of forces at work where I live.
A lot of
Um,
forces.
yeah,
That's
a lot of elasticity and plasticity, I guess. Um, so I guess when we look at Christ's head on the stains in the wall, we are maybe already approaching matter in terms of a structuralist logic. There's already a structure there. The second we see the face of Christ on the wall, um, or on a piece of bread. Why do I feel like that was like a TV show where they put like a piece of toast in the toaster and then it looked like Jesus? Wasn't that like a show? I don't know. Regardless, when we're looking at fossils themselves, I wonder if Deleuze is trying to say that there is almost this, I don't know, like we can't necessarily imagine what it is until we've fully put it together. Like we can't approach it with any pre-established representations of something. I don't know. I don't fully know what that last sentence is really getting at.
yeah.
However,
I'm not
what we
sure either.
can conclude. Sorry, Rice, no, what were you going to say?
No, it's I'm not too sure either. I was just trying to think about how he's speaking about the imagination here in Leibniz exactly. If this is maybe akin to how Spinoza speaks of it, or like I'm not too sure because you mentioned that this might suggest a more structural relationship and just merely referring it to the imagination as maybe an error of the imagination or a mishap would entail. I, I'm not. I don't. I suppose I'm just not really aligning that very well at the moment.
Yeah, no, totally. I don't think that, and I think you're right to point out that I don't think he's specifically like attacking a structuralist model of thought fully. But I think that it's kind of interesting that he is bringing in Christ here and how maybe when we approach matter, I was just thinking maybe we approach it with already a preset, maybe system. Um, but maybe, that's not right. I mean, notice if we cut out that portion, it says even the fossils in matter are not explained by our faculty of imagination, but refer to the plastic forces that pass through already existing organisms. So this could be referring to the fossil that we see itself having been an already existing organism, or maybe even ourselves, where we're approaching to try and understand what the fossil is, what it belongs to, what the creature could have looked like. So I kind of see, in a way, it's saying that there are these plastic forces, these what we can say this organic matter that already constitutes the organisms that can truly determine um, the creature that the fossil is, rather than approaching it solely through, I don't know, a form of matter that we have already pre-imposed some kind of belief in. So all we can get at here, and unless we can also come back, but I think what we can get at with this paragraph is a bit simple. We're seeing that there is organic and inorganic matter, in that they are the same, but they're shaped differently. They're the same kind of they're the same matter. You can't just say that organic is fully separate, and that's what I was trying to say with like patina here, right? It's like you can't say that the hermit crab in terms of matter is different. Like it's completely different than the shell. It's all matter, but they're both shaped by different forces. So whatever the plastic forces are, that's just different than the elastic forces of other matter, I guess you could say. And with that being said, I feel like we can move on to the next paragraph. Let's begin. If plastic forces can be distinguished, it is not because the living being goes beyond mechanism. It is because mechanisms are not sufficiently machinic. The error of mechanism is not that it is too artificial to give an account of the living, but that it is not artificial enough, not machinic enough. Our mechanisms are, in effect, composed of parts that are not in turn machines, whereas the organism is infinitely, sorry, I've lost my wording, whereas the organism is infinitely machined. A machine whose parts or pieces are machines only transformed by the different folds it receives. Thus, plastic forces are more machinic than mechanical, and they allow us to define Baroque machines. It might be objected that the mechanisms of inorganic nature already go to infinity, since the spring has a composition that is itself infinite, or since the fold always refers to other folds. But in each case, an external determination, or the direct action of the environment, is necessary in order to pass from one level to another, without which we would reach a stopping point, as with our own mechanisms. By contrast, the living organism, by virtue of preformism, has an internal determination that makes it pass from fold to fold, or constitutes machines of machines to infinity. One might say that between the organic and the inorganic, there is a difference of vector, the latter going toward even greater masses in which statistical mechanisms operate, the former toward ever smaller and polarized masses in which an individuating machinery or internal individuation is exerted. Is this a premonition on Leibniz's part of several themes that will only be developed much later? For Leibniz, certainly, internal individuation can only be explained at the level of souls. This is because organic interiority is merely derivative and has not only an envelope of coherence or cohesion and not of inherence or inhesion. It is an interiority of space and not yet of the notion. It is an internalization of the exterior, an invagination of the outside, which would not be produced by its own were there not veritable interiorities elsewhere. It remains the case that it is the organic body that in this manner confers on matter an interior through which the principle of individuation is exerted on it. Whence the invocation of the leaves of a tree, no two ever being exactly alike because of their veins or folds. We saw 17. There is a footnote here, and I'll read that here. It says, our mechanisms are in effect composed of parts that are not in turn machines. And then he cites the tooth of a metal wheel has parts or fragments which, as far as we are concerned, are not artificial and which have about them nothing of the character of a machine in relation to the use for which the wheel was intended. But machines of nature, that is to say, living bodies, are still machines in the least of their parts ad infinitum. And then Leibniz also wrote in a letter, plastic force is in the machine. Okay, and then there's 18, and this just looks like referring to Leibniz's technological inception from Serres. Okay, so this was a lot of good information. I think part of it does clarify what we were talking about with the sort of plastic and elastic forces, specifically when we are getting to machines. So what I find kind of interesting here, let me go up a little bit. Sorry if you can't fully see. I don't know if my screen's like fully sharing, but what is sort of Deleuze meaning when he says that mechanisms are not sufficiently machinic? And I think for me, it's a little hard to talk about this purely because anti-Oedipus, there's all of this talk of machines and machinery. So we might be having to get away from that a little bit because it's just a different text. But is he saying that a simple machine itself is very simple? Is he trying to make a distinction between an organism and a machine? Or is he using this sort of like anti-Oedipus, framework? What I see kind of interesting here is that he's talking about how matter is always kind of in flux. Is there this level that the inorganic is relating to the organic and organic to the inorganic? How does that work? It's kind of curious what people maybe think here. And again, sorry for the cat. I have a Sphinx cat, and he's just very loud. One thing that maybe I would say a little bit with like my interpretation is that when he's talking about the machinic and the machine, I guess like part of me is thinking that um, part of me is thinking that there's two kinds of machines. I guess we can start there because if it's all matter and there's two kind of sides to it, the plastic and the elastic, I think we could probably read machine here in terms of a living kind of machine or a non-living machine, like the organic type or the non. When he's talking about the machine, though, I think what he's trying to say, and someone can kind of correct me if I'm wrong, is we're also talking about active and passive forces here, like sort of what Reisnoza was saying as well. It's that mechanisms are not sufficiently machinic. So when you take something like a clock, or when you take something like a car, or so on and so forth, that is a machine doing something. A clock ticks. At the same time, a living being like a human walks. What is that distinction here in matter, and what gives rise to that distinction? So I think what he's trying to say is that you have an organism, like a living organism, being made of various parts, and those parts themselves are. See, I feel like he's saying those parts are machines, but they're unique kind of machines that are decently machinic, if that kind of makes sense. I feel like the the organs of the body is obviously that's a very different kind of machine than a clock. So that's kind of what I'm thinking. I'm also thinking too here, where he's talking about moving from fold to fold. I wonder what that sort of looks like because he does say here that non-living or just like elastic matter, I guess you could say, needs this kind of pressure to move and change externally. Yeah, right here. But in each case, an external determination or the direct action of the environment is necessary in order to pass from one level to another, without which we would reach a stopping point, as with our own mechanism. So it seems like matter is always moving. So how I'm reading this is matter is always on the move. It's never fully fixed, as we know, because it cannot be fully hard and it cannot be fully indeterminately fluid. So it has to be always in that state of flux. It's always being folded. But there's a difference here in plastic and elastic forces. The way that I read it is that the elastic force or the matter on the elastic side needs a pressure, or it needs something quote unquote external in order for the movement of it. Whereas maybe with a living organism, you have the fold being generated machinically kind of from within. So it's a question as to what the machine is able to do. I'm kind of curious if people have a view on that.
Yeah, I how I'm reading this here is that I'm um somewhat putting together the machine with the organic, the mechanism, with the with the inorganic, and I'm looking toward this later, a little bit later in the paragraph here when he says that the inorganic and the inorganic is a difference of vector. I think that is sort of
Mm-hmm.
helping in illustrating this when he sort of when he paints this as this active organic matter is actually individuating itself actively. So whereas the inorganic simply doesn't do that. It's just it can't do that. It's seems with what he's saying here. Um, to have external determinations which cannot be explained from within the matter itself.
Yeah. I think you brought up a great point here, and what you said sort of makes me think if we just take like we were talking about, if we just take two different machines, if I'm just going to use the alarm clock example, let's say I have a battery powered thing. It needs the battery, right? It needs this external thing or maybe electricity or whatever to function and in order to move. Whereas or a car, someone needs to turn it on. I think with the organic, what we're talking about, like the heart beats, and there, it's almost like there doesn't need to be that external thing. But in a way, though, in a way, I'm sure something had to eventually cause that, right? Like the body, the organic body, needed to be born first. So might that be also a little weird on Deleuze's part then? Like, is he then trying to separate the organic as being almost like, I don't know, fully self sufficient? Because it's also not, right? Like,
Yeah, think I think because I've been using the distinction between activity and passivity here, and I think I think when we conceive something as active, it's um at least what I'm thinking of right here is that it's much less of something which is wholly isolated um and something which it just kind of occurs, I guess, to speak of it crudely there, it just kind of is. I
mhm.
think it's much more of something which brings together the call brings together that which would otherwise be passive in an isolated sense. It makes it to where that is conceived within itself, actively
Yeah,
so, and that's
yeah.
what we mean by active. So it's I know I don't want to overlay too much Spinoza, that's why I'm avoiding that language, but at the same time, at the same time, I I can't help myself considering, that they were
No,
in
I mean,
active
look, well, here's
correspondence and whatnot, but
well, one, your name on Discord is Rise knows this, so I feel like you have to. And then
yeah.
two, I feel like I feel like, Deleuze is I mean his whole I mean his doctoral thesis, like everything's building on Spinoza for him. So I think that of course you're totally spot on that I think that there is I think the language you're using makes sense given that I think he's also saying something very similar. Um,
Mhm.
so yeah, don't feel bad. One thing I did want to add before we move on, I feel pretty confident, and of course, people feel free to cut me off or comment or whatever when you're ready to move on. But I think one more thing that I think is worth mentioning is that where is it? He is talking a lot about individuation here. I think um, he gives that example at the very end that there's there are two leaves on a tree or whatever. Take two leaves, they're never exactly the same because of their particular, folding. So this just kind of wanted to add that to me, this reads already as we're getting away from the kind of Platonist or the Aristotelian view of essence. We're already starting to see that it's not that there is an innate essence to a tree or a leaf or whatever. It's that there's these internal patterns of folding or these external forces of matter that form this difference between the two. So there's also that individuation, which is really important here. Okay, I think that this is a great paragraph that we can move on from. Let's do it.
Yes.
Let's go to the next one. Okay. And also there's some pictures down here in the text too, but I don't know if we'll fully get to it today, but we're almost done with this whole chapter though. There's only a couple pages left, but we'll see. Folding, unfolding no longer means simply tension release, contraction dilation, but enveloping, developing, involution, evolution. The organism is defined by its capacity to fold its own parts to infinity and to unfold them not to infinity, but to the degree of development assigned to the species. Thus, an organism is enveloped in this. Thus, an organism is developed in the semen, preformation of organs, and semens are enveloped within each other to infinity, the interlocking of germinal matter, like Russian dolls. It is the first fly that contains all the flies to come, each being called in its turn to unfold its own parts. When the right moment arrives, oh, sorry, I thought that was a comma. Well, it was, but when the right moment arrives. And when an organism dies, it is not annihilated, but involutes and abruptly folds in on itself in the newly dormant seed, leaping over the intermediate stages. It would be easiest to say that to unfold is to increase and grow, whereas to fold is to diminish and reduce, to withdraw into the recesses of a world. However, a simple metric change would not account for the difference between the organic and the inorganic, the machine and the spring. And above all, it would make us forget that we do not simply go from part to part, more or less large or small, but from fold to fold. When a part of a machine is still a machine, the smaller unit is not the same as the whole. When Leibniz invokes the superimposed clothing of the harlequin, the underwear is not the same as the outer garments. That is why there is a metamorphosis or a schematicism. Hold on, sorry, I'm mispronouncing this. Metaschematism. Rather than a change in dimension. Every animal is double, but as heterogenetic or heteromorphic, like the butterfly folded into the caterpillar, which will soon unfold. The doubling will even be simultaneous, to the degree that the ovule is not a simple envelope, but furnishes one part whose other part is in the male element. In fact, it is the inorganic that repeats itself in its difference from the next dimension, since it is always an external milieu that penetrates the body. The organism, on the contrary, envelops an internal milieu that necessarily contains other species of organisms, which in turn envelop internal milieus that contain yet more organisms. The members of a living body are filled with other living bodies, plants, animals, dot, 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 dot. It is thus the inorganic fold that is simple and direct, whereas the organic fold is always composite, intersected, indirect, mediated by an internal milieu. For footnote 20, it's coming from New Essays. Bonnet wrongly reproaches his teacher Leibniz for holding to variations of size. So Deleuze is drawing a bit on Leibniz's own educational history, it looks like. For 21 and 22, we're just doing some citations. Thanks for doing cites, Deleuze, because some of your previous work didn't. Didn't as I feel like he's citing a lot in this compared to some other texts. Just making a joke. Okay, so for this paragraph here, there's just so much going on, so many interesting examples. And Reisnoza wrote Deleuze and his obsession with Genesis. Yes, I mean this is all that he's trying to get at. When you take a thing, that thing is already in a constant state of movement and flux and change. So what is the genesis of it? And this, in a way, we're seeing can critique a lot of other kinds of philosophy. For example, when Deleuze is critiquing dialectics, Hegelian dialectics, for example, Hegel's easy to say, okay, I'm going to take two things, A and B. A is not B, B is not A. Or he's able to take an object and find that it's contradictory. Deleuze is trying to ask, well, where does that object, what gives that object the emergence in the first place? What are the conditions that allows us to point to something and say, that is X? And then furthermore, what are the conditions that allow us to differentiate between X and Y? That's kind of what I think he's getting at here. So I like what he's starting. We can maybe start with the first sentence to me. He says, folding, unfolding means enveloping, developing, involution, evolution, rather than something like tension and release. To me, I felt like the earlier stuff, especially last week, it really sounded that folding was extremely like a physical compression, especially when he's talking about elastic forces and springs and whatnot. He's talking about compression and expansion in earlier pages. But then now he's starting to say something extremely biological, I would say. And here, when he's talking about folding and unfolding, he's meaning it in a bit of a different way. Is is the organism for Deleuze here a living being, a living thing? Is is he saying that the future development of the organism is already embedded inside of it? Am I reading that right? I mean, maybe we can use the example from last time, the example being the leaves of a tree. When Deleuze is talking about the leaves of a tree, or a tree itself, what if we take the seed? What's already folded into the seed? I mean, you can't crack a seed open and be like, here's this leaf, and here's the trunk or whatever. Um, so there's some level of folding there, and that's the way I kind of am looking at it with Deleuze, and that's why I like to say it's in the context of origami, because that's the example Deleuze uses. It's folded so many, so many, so many, so many times, and then after so many unfoldings, it's starting to make something novel. It's starting to make a tree. It's starting to make an animal or a star or the universe that we're dealing with, reality. So he's saying that this entire reality that we have, or that exists, matter, all of it, is not simply a question of a god that, you know, pulled a car back and let it go and it went forward. It's not simply tension and then release and then that's where it is. It looks like he's saying that there's something maybe more evolutionary at hand. And I love that, just I love that idea of folding. There's so much compressed, even though he seems to be getting away from maybe some of the language of compression, but there's so much compressed into that seed that over time it unfolds. I don't know if I'm fully getting that right, but he also uses the example of, he's talking about Russian dolls here in the context of semen. He's talking about the first fly containing all the flies to come. He's talking about, I mean, my favorite example, low key, is probably the caterpillar one. I actually really appreciate that example about how the butterfly is folded into or inside of the caterpillar. So when we look at development in this context, to develop is not tension and release. It's not to start off as a baby and then you grow up. Rather, there's already a folding process from the get-go where each living organism is slowly or quickly unfolding, and a new expression is continuously being generated through that unfolding and through that development. So, my question would be to people here, do we think that there is a fundamental difference then between enlarging, growing, and, you know, and metamorphosis and unfolding? Is Deleuze maybe being a bit, is are we like vibing with his point? Do we like it? I'm just kind of curious if I'm even reading that right, or if other people have their own interpretation. I mean, I just think that there's so much that's happening in this paragraph. Um, if no one has comments on that, I would totally be down to hear people's thoughts on the question of doubling. When he says the doubling, or every animal is double, or the doubling will be simultaneous. When he's talking about doubling, what is he talking about? Yeah. Yeah, Rise
Oh
Noza, what are you
God,
thinking?
I can't quite contain myself here. With with the way in which he discusses folding and unfolding. It's he seems to be going beyond this a more simplistic or reductive view of the folding function as simply a matter of recession or dilation, and because that seems to presuppose something matter more static, a matter that doesn't actually um, metamorph uh, go through this metamorphosis that's provided with the organism. And the way in which he speaks of folding and unfolding here is it really is to me like he's applying the logic that he already saw in Spinoza between implication and explication, and applying
Mm,
it here now to within the organism, expanding it from or moving it from not just substance but to, as we would say, modes for itself. Of course, we know that Leibniz and Spinoza differed on this point insofar as the former had thought of more of a plurality of substances, but it's I think that's sort of what he's getting at here. So if we think of it on similar lines of this genesis or this folding and unfolding function, and I think that we're going to get on a good track. Just,
no,
I do
yeah, I
like
mean,
how you're
yeah.
approaching it.
No, I mean, everything you're saying is just like, to me, it just reads as so spot on. Like, I just think, yeah, like I do see the Spinoza here. You're right. They do different, and like Leibniz believes that there's an infinite number of monads, and Spinoza's like, there's one substance, not an infinite number of them. And but it's still, I think where I'm still questioning Deleuze here, and again, I'm gonna give him some time. It's like, what does it mean to say that a monad is continuously, unfolding? Like, how are all of them unfolding and folding in sync? And
Mhm.
Leibniz has God to solve that problem. He's like, yeah, God just established that every monad is like an instrument in the orchestra, and God established that they all are harmonious with each other. So reality appears like this pre-established, each monad is changing its internal state at all times in sync with every other one. I don't know how Deleuze is going to solve that. I mean, I like this idea of folding though, but yeah, some of the substance stuff you're bringing up is already making me question how Deleuze is going to solve that.
Mhm. Yeah, it's I'm not too sure either. Uh, maybe if I was more familiar with Leibniz beyond secondhand accounts, but uh, yeah, I just wanted to go to the how Deleuze's interest in Spinoza or in Leibniz to begin with here.
I mean, yeah, it's just
Yes.
too fun. I think. I mean, gosh, though, it's just reading this. I don't know if anyone else agrees. I mean, I know Ryzen knows what we're talking. It's like reading this though. It does read very one substancy to me. Like it just does. It seems like if I mean he's talking about how it's not the Cartesian fully separable matter. He's talking about how it's fluid, spring-like, there's elastic and plastic forces. It sounds like you can't there's no separation here. So it reads like that. I mean, he hasn't really introduced the monad yet, but it's just something to think about, you know what I mean?
Yeah, something I'm really interested in this paragraph too. Or at least if I read that right. Was when Leibniz mentions infinity at a certain part, or
Hold
yes,
on. Let's see. I'm trying to see.
or was that in the past paragraph? And I just
I
skipped
mean,
over it. But
I will say he does say multiple times that the fold folds into like to infinity, right? Like it's
yes,
an infinite folding and an infinite unfolding. Like like the way we're looking at it, right, is like a piece of paper that's folded an infinite number of times. Every time that infinite paper is unfolded, it expresses a new thing, like origami. And for Deleuze, every time there's an folding or unfolding of this sheet of paper that's infinite, you get something new, and that's for him true novelty, and it's just infinitely folding and unfolding.
Yes. Yeah. I because when I think of this, I'm also going to difference repetition as well because in difference repetition to those it obviously shows a bunch of appreciation for Leibniz here, but he also uses this as somewhat of a point to critique Leibniz, or at least to diverge from him on this, at least insofar as Leibniz conceived these as all converging upon a more single path. I don't know if path is a really good way to describe it, but um, which is his account of impossibility. We're not there yet, obviously. That's somewhere in here. But but right now, he does just seem to be speaking of this as it's happening, as divergence occurs, and Genesis along with that through the very unfolding of, I don't want to say substance because it doesn't use that word, but that's what I'm thinking of
Hmm.
here. As I'm just gonna say the organism, but yeah.
No, no, I mean, I love what you're saying, and in a way, I wonder if what you're saying is also answering the question I had about doubling. I kind of want to take what you're saying and just see. I mean, what I'm curious about with this doubling question is he trying to argue that folds are always doubled because there's always a folding and an unfolding at work? Or is he more so saying that when we're dealing with matter, we're always dealing with plasticity and elasticity. So there's these kind of two kinds of folds. So when he says that there's this doubling, every animal is double. When he says that, the butterfly is folded into the caterpillar. There's two there. You have the caterpillar as this emerging thing. You have the butterfly emerging from it. I'm kind of curious if he's saying that there's a folding and unfolding here that kind of delineates. Is he just talking about doubling in terms of organic and living beings, or is all matter itself doubled? I mean, that's something I'm thinking through. I don't know, like what you were saying, I don't know, made me think about it. I don't know if there's.
I think what he's speaking of here, I think it's more focused on the organic and how it and the relation between unfolding and folding here, which both essentially, I think he's trying to say that both occur with the organic, but I feel like he's contrasting this with the inorganic, which doesn't really have this individuation to it. Um, so that's how I'm reading this, at least. But
I mean, it doesn't have but remember, it has its individuation, right? Because the two rocks are still individuated. But I think
oh yes, yeah.
what you're saying though is right. It's that there's an even different kind of individuation at work here when we're dealing with the organic, right? And and what you said, I think maybe you're just spot on here. Right after this, it says, in fact, it is the inorganic that repeats itself twice, in its difference from the next dimension. So since it is always an external milieu that penetrates the body. So it's kind of interesting. You can't necessarily have the butterfly without the cocoon, or maybe the cocoon without where it's nestled in nature. You can't necessarily have the bird without the bird's nest. So in a way, I love what you said about how we're really contrasting here between the doubling and the kinds of forces. You can't have the hermit crab without the shell. I mean, these things are co-produced in nature, and there's almost that doubling there. I mean, there's like a doubling in the organic, and then it's also repeating in the inorganic, and yeah, we're kind of seeing that formation. So that makes sense.
I like the last sentence here, right? He just
I
says
just
that the
paused. I literally was about to move on, and I just paused. Yeah, tell me why you like it. I think this one's great.
I just think it's like a good little summary, I guess you could say, of what he's getting at with with this paragraph. At least just saying the former or the inorganic fold, simple and direct, but the organic fold, composite, uh, intersected, indirect, and there's always this infinity, you could say, of internal milieux. I think that, correct me if I'm wrong here, but the way I'm thinking of infinity here is because inorganic Um, an organism is always going to contain an organism within it, then we just sort of see this mirror effect of going infinitely further, farther, and farther, with more little organisms in between. And this seems to be the language of mediation and being indirect here. Whereas the inorganic fold, which is more about external bodies interacting with each other externally, and that sort of individuation there, like we said, with the two kinds of individuation, it's much more direct. It doesn't have that mediation within it. Um,
Yeah,
It's
bingo.
kind of
Yeah.
strange to see Deleuze using the language of mediation, though. I'm gonna be honest, because uh,
Yeah, like what does it mean then for the organic matter to be mediated by an internal milieu? It's like, and I think that's where we're also seeing something interesting here. Like there's two floors. There are two, like there are monads that are more clear than others. The soul versus non-soul. And I agree when I see mediated by an internal milieu, I'm thinking to myself, that internal milieu almost sounds like an agent or something agential, even though I know that's what he's not getting at. But um, I don't know. It makes me think about it as such.
I think it's just because of the once again it's the distinction between activity and passivity that we're kind of looking at here. Probably might be making you think of it in that way, but I don't know. It's just the language of mediation is very strange here. When I think of Deleuze, I know he tends to be trying to get away from any sort of thought which reduces itself to a logic of mediation. Uh, his critique of Hegel, for instance. But it maybe it's just, but obviously he's not. It's lost on me. But the sense in which he's doing it here is, it follows. It follows. It's just I'm just kind of wondering where he's going with this.
Yeah, no, totally same. I mean, me this is making sense, but totally the language of this like this internal mediation versus like the external, it's and for someone trying to get rid of all like, spending his academic career getting rid of a lot of these dichotomies, he's almost kind of forced into looking at two sides of reality, right? The organic versus inorganic, plastic, elastic, internal versus external milieu, and like you're saying with mediation, I think we're adding another element. What could help us though, I actually do think that the next paragraph is going to help us. So I want to move there now. This will actually dispel kind of a very common metaphysical myth, even maybe of Spinoza. So let's do it. Matter is folded two times, once by elastic forces and once by plastic forces, without being able to pass from the first to the second. Thus, the universe is not a great living being. It is not the animal in itself. Leibniz rejects this hypothesis as much as he rejects that of a universal spirit. And organisms retain an irreducible individuality, and organic linkages retain an irreducible plurality. It is nonetheless the case that the two kinds of force, the two kinds of folds, masses, and organisms, are strictly coextensive. It is not that there are fewer living beings than there are parts of inorganic matter. Certainly, the external milieu is not a living being, but it is a lake or a pond, that is, a fish hatchery. The invocation of the lake or pond here takes on a new meaning, since the pond, as well as the marble tile, no longer refers to the elastic undulations that flow through them like inorganic folds, but to the fish that populate them like organic folds. And the living being itself, the internal milieus it contains are full of even more hatcheries filled with other fish, a swarm. The inorganic folds of the milieus pass between two organic folds. For Leibniz, as for the Baroque, the principles of reason are veritable cries. Not everything is a fish, but there are fish everywhere. There is no universality, but there is a ubiquity of the living. So this is to me such an interesting passage because Deleuze is explaining, and Leibniz says this in the Monadology, but Deleuze is obviously carrying with it his own his own spin about how the universe, as we talk about it, is not just one living being. And I wonder if this is critiquing a little bit of pantheism. I wonder if this is kind of getting also maybe at some of uh, jabbing a little bit as like one substance being God, being a universal kind of spirit. Um, Curious what we think. Yeah, Reznoza, what are you thinking?
Um, I'm just thinking here, because I'm looking at the language right now. Um, as he rejects that of universal spirit. I'm universal spirit. That's itself is a quite loaded term here. It's not one that I would associate with Spinoza more than I would associate with
Hegel.
Hegel. Yes,
Yeah, no,
yes.
totally, totally.
It's um, mm, I'm not the most sure at the moment here. It's uh,
Well, maybe I jumped the gun. Like if you look at the first sentence here, he writes that matter is folded twice, once by elastic and plastic forces. So it's kind of funny, Resnoza, we were talking about the last paragraph. The organic and inorganic, there's folded twice, and then, they themselves fold over each other. So folding's happening everywhere. And matter is folded twice. So if that is the case, I think Deleuze is asking the question, if plastic forces are everywhere, then why isn't, if life is everywhere, then why is the universe just not one big animal, one big organism? Like, humans are like bacteria in the universe's gut, in the same way that there's bacteria in humans' gut. Like, why is the universe not just one big animal? And yeah, I think that's kind of what Deleuze is trying to get at. And what's the solution to that, right? Like, why does Leibniz disagree?
yeah. Mm, I like the example of the lake and the fish here. I think this might paint it well as at least some sort of external habitation, perhaps that is necessary, I could say, to the organic, but it's not itself the organic, and it's the organic necessitates its existence, but um, it's mm, and in fact the this inorganic lake or pond is itself um, mm, um, mm, yeah. I'm trying to look get the right words for this, but the the folds within this lake or pond itself now turn with the fish become organic folds that just go further and further into this infinitude of milieus. That's mm, I think that might connect with what he says later here in the paragraph, the inorganic folds of the milieus. Yeah, let the milieus pass between two organic folds. I'm not I'm not too sure where this is going. I'm gonna be honest. I I'm not sure if this is directly attacking a pantheistic view, but
Yeah, I mean,
it's a good way to direct it. But
it's hard to say. I mean, I think that there are certain pantheistic types, or maybe people getting into philosophy, or maybe people who have the belief that the universe is just like one big organism. And that view, though, however, is still um, it's still going to be rooted in a kind of transcendence that Deleuze disagrees with. Um, and without getting too much into Kant and whatnot, but when we're looking at determinate versus reflective judgment, what we're looking at here, I think what Deleuze is trying to get at is, it's not that there's a strict organism like the Cartesian subject that is, there's human versus nature, and humans are above nature. But at the same time, other thinkers, specifically like Kant, might have another view of, I mean, even though, I don't want to go too far here, but there's also this review of reflective judgment where it's like rather than maybe starting with the organism, what if we start with the part, like the eye or the arm or the heart, whatever it might be, and then saying that that part has a fixed place in the overall structure of the organism. So even if you're dealing with a view metaphysically where you're taking a part, you're still relating it to a whole. And I think what Deleuze is trying to get at here is that even though you can see life everywhere, you can see like the brightness of the stars, or organic, there's bacteria or leaves or whatever. Life is everywhere in the universe in reality. That doesn't necessarily mean each individual thing we point to is particularly fixed, such as a part within a larger whole. Which is why I think he's saying here it's all coextensive, but there's another quote here, hold on, that was just thinking about. Oh my gosh, where is it? Let me see. Thus the universe is. Oh, right there. Organisms retain an irreducible individuality, and organic lineages retain an irreducible plurality. So I think what he's trying to get at there is that you can't necessarily just say that the individual is only an individual in its placement or relation to a whole, and that means that it has its fixed place. Instead, it seems like life is there is still an individuality, which is why rather than viewing it as an organism or an animal, I think he's trying to say what you just said, right? Now, it's a pond. Reality is this big pond. The universe is a pond, and then there are fish everywhere in the pond, and they're both effectuating each other, co-producing each other. But that doesn't mean that the pond itself is this organism. Um, and sorry if someone unmuted to talk. If I was yapping, but yeah, like that's my thinking here.
Yeah, actually, this now that you bring up that, I kind of overlooked that. Wow, that sentence you just brought up here, or that quote, retain the organisms retain irreducible individuality and the organic lineages and irreducible plurality. That I think that sort of actually goes pretty well with what we were talking about earlier with the divergence on substance here with
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Leibniz having plurality of them, these irreducible, uh, these these irreducible things, or with organisms here in this case, the individuality of them, and in their infinitude being irreducible in that plurality produced by their own activity. It's I think that's actually what we're getting at here. Um, so it's yeah,
Well,
that's how
I
I'm
mean,
looking at it.
well, the thing is this the way that Deleuze is resolving the modes problem that he finds in Spinoza? Right? You have finite modes. You have Noah, a table, whatever, a germ, bacteria, finite beings, finite things, finite modes that are all dependent on substance. That there is one substance. I'm curious here is if he's trying to distance himself a little bit with Leibniz by showing, well, hold on, there is an irreducible individuality to all of these things, and they don't necessarily depend upon a primary substance, that they are in themselves their own individual substance, part and parcel with a pond. Like that's the hard thing for me to get to, because we haven't gotten to, like I said, the pre-established harmony yet. But that's kind of my thinking, that there's almost this departure from Spinoza a bit.
The pluralism here, I suppose. Um,
Right, right on.
uh,
I mean,
um,
and funnily enough, you know, it's when he talks about the one and the many or the multiple, he's trying to sort of say that the the one is the many, or monism equals pluralism. I mean, that's how I mean, they say that in A Thousand Plateaus, monism equals pluralism. So maybe Leibniz is the key link here to proving that.
Mhm. Which, yeah, I mean, Deleuze, that does run throughout Deleuze in general. And it's not really something that he detaches too much from Spinoza. I think the way he frames it is much more as adding on to Spinozism, at least. I
Yeah,
at least how I
totally.
read it, but it's sort of because all of these there's explicitly an interview that I want to paraphrase right now where he discusses that he is a Spinozist in um, the immanence in Spinoza's philosophy, but he does take heavily from Leibniz in the question of the modes that you're addressing here, without considering himself fully Leibnizian in this. And I'm I'm just curious to see um, how this happens.
Totally, totally. I mean, I'm excited. I'm excited to keep digging in. So let's do this next paragraph. Okay. It might be said that the theory of preformation and enclosure has long been abandoned, as confirmed by observations made through the microscope. The meaning of development or evolution has been inverted, since it now designates epigenesis, that is, the apparition of organisms and organs that are neither preformed nor enclosed within each other, but are formed from something else that does not resemble them. The organ does not refer back to a pre existing organ, but to a much more general and less differentiated sketch. Development does not go from the small to the large through growth or augmentation, but from the general to the special through the differentiation of an initially undifferentiated field, sometimes under the action of the external milieu, sometimes under the influence of internal forces that are directive and directional, but non constitutive or pre-forming. Nonetheless, to the degree that preformism goes beyond simple metric variations, it tends to approach an epigenesis in as much as epigenesis is forced to maintain a kind of virtual or potential preformation. This is because the essential point is elsewhere. The essential point is that what the two conceptions have in common is to conceive of the organism as a fold, as an originary bending or folding, and biology has never renounced its determination of the living, as is shown today in the fundamental folding of the globular protein. Preformism is the form under which the truth was perceived in the 17th century in relation to the first microscopes. It is hardly surprising then that one confronts the same problems on the side of epigenesis and on the side of preformation. Are all the modes of folding modifications or degrees of development of a single animal in itself? Or are there irreducible types of folding, as Leibniz believed, from a preformist perspective, but also Cuvier and Baer from an epigenesis perspective? Certainly, a great opposition subsists between the two points of view. For epigenesis, the organic fold is produced, unearthed, or pushed up from a surface that is relatively spread out or unified. How could a redoubling, an invagination, or an intubation be prefigured? Whereas for performism, an organic fold always flows from another fold, at least from the inside of the same type of organization. Every fold comes from a fold. Plica ex plica. Using Heideggerian terms, one could say that the fold of epigenesis is an Einfalt, or that it is the differentiation of an undifferentiated, and that the fold of preformation is a Zweifalt, not a fold in two, since every fold is necessarily so, but a fold of two, a between two, in the sense that it is difference that differentiates itself. From this point of view, we cannot be sure that preformism does not have a future. Okay, that was a lot. Um, he's also drawing from Heidegger. I myself uh, haven't really read much, only like the question concerning technology, essentially. Um, so I might not be able to comment a lot on that, but if you're a Heideggerian, please feel free. And furthermore, he is talking about differentiation and differentiation, and I'm not the most familiar, and I'm forgetting about difference and repetition. So somebody can also bring that up. He also talks a lot about that difference in the context of his essay on structuralism. But regardless, that's kind of coming towards the end. I think we can still, um, with the help of everyone here and with what we have earlier in this passage, I feel like we can come a long way with this. So notice something he's saying at the top here. It might be said that the theory of preformation and enclosure has been abandoned. So when he's talking about preformation, it looks like he's trying to say that even if it's possible that organisms are not just like these pre-made things inside of other things, then is it possible to still think about, I don't know, folding? Like that's like how I'm reading this, even though I know that probably didn't make a lot of sense. I guess for me, I'm a bit confused as to why he's discussing some of the abandonment of this theory of preformation. Um, yeah, like is he defending this kind of view, or is he kind of disagreeing? I mean, he's obviously saying that development itself is not going from small to large, right? We talked about that. It's not necessarily when we see something develop, it's just getting bigger, and that's development. He's saying that is a question of folding and unfolding. Um, he does note here that it begins with this quote, initially undifferentiated field to this differentiation of it. So he's talking about going from the general to the special. Kind of curious what people are making of this. Like, what does that general mean? What does it mean to be special here? I mean, I'm just kind of curious myself.
Yeah, I think um I don't know if it's necessary to go to difference repetition for this exactly. I think when Deleuze is talking about epigenesis here, like he's like just literally talking about the biological concept of something undifferentiated going to something more undifferentiated. Now, if he does, I I don't think I was paying close enough attention, but if he does use if he does contrast undifferentiation with differentiation somewhere in this paragraph, then that'll be interesting. But um, I, which
Yeah, I mean, he is. I hear you though. I think I do think you're on the right side here. Like I feel like we don't need a full on like, okay, let's go read difference and repetition and his essay on structuralism. I think I think you are right that epigenesis just does seem to be a very we're really talking a lot here about, to me, like biology, and in the development of the organism. Um, but I think the larger point here, Reisnoza, is is going to be how he's just in general talking about Genesis. I know right now we're talking about like biology, but I think he's probably already bringing in. I'm just going to assume Heidegger here, the difference between differentiation and differentiation. I feel like that will play a large role moving forward and to talk about the genesis of everything, not just organic, but the inorganic too.
yeah, I'm gonna be honest. I'm not too sure how Heidegger reference plays into this, but I'm happy Deleuze is doing something similar to what we've been doing, and that's bringing in uh, other terms from philosophers who maybe didn't even live in the same time as Leibniz.
Oh,
Sometimes,
yeah, 100%. Um, so, so when we see preformism, though, really quick, I do think the kind of summary of this is literally just that we know every fold comes from another fold, which comes from another fold ad infinitum. We know that, which means that when we see the development of the organism, when we see life, when we see the organism, it is unfolding from from another fold inside of itself, which is folding and unfolding ad infinitum. So I think what he's just trying to say is that we see the form of an organism essentially, um, being produced from something general. Like I keep going back to this. He's saying that development does not go from small to large through growth or augmentation, but from general to the special through the differentiation of an initially undifferentiated field. Sometimes under the action of an external milieu, sometimes under the influence of internal forces. Like this I think is just the crux of what he's saying in this paragraph. I think, to be completely honest, it does remind me of the previous paragraphs we have been talking about, but this paragraph though does seem to be making just a very strict, like, this is what it is. Development is clearly going from the general to the special. Maybe what we can do is we can take the caterpillar example and just kind of walk through it. Deleuze is arguing that development is not necessarily the caterpillar being small, or, yeah, sure. Let's just say the caterpillar is small, the butterfly goes out and it's large. Like, that is growth. Um, that is development. He's instead saying that there are these variety of forces that are innately general in each caterpillar, and then from there, what emerges is a unique butterfly that is its own. Maybe a better example could be the tree example. You could take a litany of tree seeds, and they all might look the same. They all might generally have this general kind of folding. What emerges, however, through that unfolding is a very special tree, a tree that has its own trunk, a tree that has its own, layers of bark or its leaves or so on and so forth. So that's what I'm kind of seeing here. What I'm not liking myself, though, is that he says that it's general. I mean, I think you could also argue that the folds that compose the seed themselves are also special. Like, I'm not fully sure why he's saying that that's not as special as the tree itself, or if we're dealing with the organism. I mean, folds within each, embryo or whatever. I mean, is it just a question of appearance for Deleuze here? I mean, I feel like there's something else going on, but I don't know how he's able to say it starts from this undifferentiated field and then differentiates. It just seems like, is he arguing that certain folds um, make it so there's just kind of this, like, you can't differentiate one from the other? I mean, I thought he was trying to get at you can, because each of them is folded uniquely different. So I am a bit confused there. I don't think he's that clear.
Yeah, I'm just trying to apply the logic we've already laid out. The other two, it's with between um are more active um internally individuating forces here, which are indirect in mediating, as opposed to those more direct, simple um, forces here,
Mm-hmm.
which he seems to explicitly be laying out right here. Uh, and when we speak of this differentiation, it's he's really leaving it open here. It could happen under both, under the active or the passive. Or I'm just saying active and passive to kind
Sure.
of shorten it, I guess. But yes, it's he doesn't really provide us with like a principle or any of that sort, or which one is it going to be, or any of that. We're just not there yet. But yeah, I could see this confusion emerging.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's really interesting because I think the confusion here is it seems like he's just really oscillating so much between what preformation and epigenesis is. I mean, to me, I'm reading it like that's why for me, it's a bit confusing. So, for yeah, so he to clarify, I just want to make sure I'm reading this right. Is that preformation itself here? He just says that he says it's long been abandoned. So then, like, what is he offering? I don't know. Maybe he's just saying that the previous view is dying. That that the same being that is the caterpillar or something is now the butterfly. That there's this, like, um, preformed, already made being. And now, instead, when we look at current, scientific theory, what the accepted thing is now is how development is always something that's being differentiated. So to me, that's kind of what it reads as. I mean, when we look at footnote 24 here, it says, in the name of epigenesis, Albert Dalk can state, quote, a caudal fin can be obtained from a system of action and reaction where nothing is a priori caudal. And I think, man, I guess we should have just started with this because I feel like this quote totally is getting at that distinction here.
Hmm.
Deleuze is abandoning the view, and he's saying it has been abandoned, that there is this a priori butterfly within the caterpillar, or that there's this a priori caudal that first exists or something.
Yeah, it's
When when in reality it's actually constantly produced through differentiation.
mhm. Yeah, it's really getting past some more antiquated notions of potentiality and form and whatnot. Which these it's not that the seed contains within it the tree which it will grow into, or the plant or whatever it's going to grow into. Um, it's we're getting past that. It's the tree isn't a priori, so to speak, within the seed. Um,
See, but in a way though, the folds are there. Like I
yeah.
think that's the tricky part, right? Like within the seed, there's still forces at work, but it looks like those forces then are more generalized
Mhm.
in that
The
that
I think
specific tree emerges through unfolding.
Yeah, I think it's like a point to say that the forces are there, the form isn't, at least, or the form is to be generated
Ah,
by the
totally.
forces here.
Yeah.
It's like
So it's almost like the content is present then, but we're not sure how that fully is because we the form hasn't been unfolded yet.
yeah, and yeah, perhaps this could come off as a critique of final causality, um, which once again, I know, but Spinoza, it does seem to ring in that for me with at least with Deleuze and Leibniz using forces here to paint this sort of efficient causality.
Yeah, totally. I mean, everything you're saying to me makes sense. I just, maybe I'm a little hesitant also with Deleuze a little bit here. I don't want to get too much in that critique level, but it's, if all the forces are already there, well, then what truly is novel? Like what makes it novel? So I think he's going to be dealing with how is true novelty then developed? Like if all of the forces are in the seed, even if the form isn't there, is it purely just the form that becomes novel through how that seed interacts with an external milieu along with its internal forces? Um, you know, something we'll be uncovering. Um, the good news is, though, I think we can fully finish this first chapter. I think so. I think it is possible. Um, but I might just read a couple paragraphs at a time or move a little fast. Really quick for footnote 25, there is a long footnote here from Deleuze cites Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, a partisan of epigenesis, and remains one of the greatest philosophers of organic folding. Giving the modifications of a same animal, he esteems that one can move from one to the other by way of folding, a unity of the plan of composition. If a vertebrate is folded in such a fashion that the two parts of his spinal column are turned toward each other, its head goes toward its feet, the lower area toward the neck, and its viscera arranged as they are in a cephalopod. This is what prompts Bayer's opposition in the very name of epigenesis, and already the anger of Cuvier, who posits the diversity of axes of development or of planes of organization. Despite his monism, in any event, Geoffrey can be called Leibnizian in other respects. He explains the organism in terms of a material force that does not change the nature of bodies, but adds to them new forms and new relations. It is an impulsive or attractive electric force in the style of Kepler. It can refold elastic fluids, and it operates in very short distances in the world of details or in infinitely small areas, no longer by the summation of homogeneous parts, but by the confrontation of homologous parts. Um, What an interesting footnote. Geez, I feel like that also kind of helps explain like the scientific advancements too that he's approaching and little debates or maybe big debates in the scientific community that for me I'm not fully um, familiar with. But good footnote. I want to continue. I think we are honestly close. Let's do it.
I really like. Sorry, just to
No,
add this real quick. I just really like how Deleuze is situating Leibniz within the scientific developments of his time. I think it really works here. It's
well, I think
just.
Leibniz would appreciate it being like that co-founder of calculus, right? Like he's all
Mhm.
for those recent, discoveries. Anafine Buenfesta says, you guys should check out Michael Levin's take on emerging intelligence and structures. Look into the cognitive light cone. And I am saving this. This is awesome. Thanks for the comment. We'll look into it. And you also wrote, Anafine, Levin is a Neoplatonist that, when not in the lab, articulates a world of mind. Yeah, I'm excited. I do always appreciate good uh, Neoplatonist thought. I'm not gonna lie. I know Deleuze would roll his eyes, but I think it's great. Okay, let's do this. Masses and organisms, masses and living beings, thus fill the lower floor. Why then is there another floor needed, since the sensitive or animal souls are already there, inseparable from organic bodies? Each soul even seems localizable in its body, this time as a point in a droplet which subsists in a part of the droplet when the latter is divided or diminishes in volume. Thus, in death, the soul remains right where it was, in a part of the body, however reduced it may be. The point of this view is in the body, says Leibniz. Of course, everything in the body takes place machinically, in accordance with plastic forces that are material, but these forces explain everything except the variable degrees of unity to which they lead the masses they are organizing, a plant, a worm, a vertebrate. The plastic forces of matter act on masses, but they subject them to real unities that they themselves presuppose. They make an organic synthesis, but they presuppose the soul as the unity of the synthesis, or as the, quote, immaterial principle of life, end quote. It is only here that an animism finds itself joined to organicism from the standpoint of pure unity or union, independent of any causal action. The fact remains that organisms would not, on their own account, have the causal power to fold themselves to infinity and to subsist in the ashes without the soul unities from which they are inseparable, and which are inseparable from them. This is the great difference from Malebranche. There is not only a preformism of bodies, but a pre-existence of souls in the semen. Not only are there living beings everywhere, but there are souls everywhere in matter. Hence, when an organism is called upon to unfold its own parts, its animal or sensitive soul is opened onto an entire theater where it perceives and feels in accordance with its own unity, independently of its organism, yet inseparable from it. When we look at the footnotes here, not much other than just general citations. However, from the 26th footnote, there's a letter from Leibniz. It looks like um, it says if an insect is cut into, or maybe not, I can't tell who the letter's from, but it says if an insect is cut into 1,000 parts, its soul will remain in a certain part that is still alive, which will always be as small as is necessary to be sheltered from the action of the one who cuts it. Oh, that must be Malebranche. Yeah, but no, 26. So let's see who said that. That's got to be Leibniz then. Um, this to me is really, really interesting. Um, there's just so much here. I think the general thing is that it's kind of interesting. It's like organisms always contain these animal or sensitive souls, it looks like. So then if that's the case, if animals already contain it, then why is the upper floor of the Baroque house necessary at all? I think that's the question. So, I mean, the point might be that the bodies explain, organization to an extent, how matter is fundamentally organized, but what does the soul give us? I mean, that's a separate question. The soul is giving us a particular perspective or clarity in relation to the body. Now, if you take that footnote, you cut an insect up into a billion pieces, there is still a soul monad of that insect that is there and that cannot be further divided or cut up. So within each of us, the people listening to the recording or you know writing comments or whatever, there is an individual soul monad for all of us. Now it almost seems like this is Deleuze like at his most, I don't want to say Cartesian, but I think people can probably, you know, see what I'm getting at. But I'm already kind of thinking that maybe there needs to be a floor, and the upper floor here, the higher floor, in order to give maybe more perspective. I mean, that's kind of what I'm thinking. And yeah, I'm also considering this question of plastic. Like, there's this plasticity here that he's discussing. I don't know if I want to fully dig into that just yet, because he says the plastic forces of matter act on masses, but they subject them to real unities that they themselves presuppose. So he is talking about unity here. So we kind of started with these almost these parts, or like what constitutes matter with plastic and elastic forces, and now we're getting at to, oh wow, there's like entire bodies here. So what here is giving a body a perspective? When you take what we call Noah's body with a mouth and eyes and everything, that body has perspective of the world, even though it's composed of infinite monads that also have their own perspective. But there's something unique here about the monad that is Noah. So that's kind of how I'm reading this. I don't know if anyone
Huh.
has thoughts as well.
No, I like that because this actually kind of funny. I feel like we bring up something earlier in conversation and then it comes back to hit us and um, later in the text. I, I now we discussed plastic forces in terms of genesis, and now he's discussing them in terms of synthesis. It's that, which
Mm,
is how
true.
I kind
Totally
of
right.
attach that.
Totally
But
right.
yeah, I was just going out on a limb there when I originally said that, but I don't know to what extent that's applying here, but I really like how that's working. The soul here, it's the notion of the soul here, it's as the unity of synthesis or as the immaterial principle of life. I think this I just think it's really working here, but I'm trying to find how
Yeah.
to explain it, but I do like what you're doing right here.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking to myself too. It's like this idea of this soul. I mean, remember, all monads are immaterial. They're not in space, they're not out of space. They're sort of foundation, a spatium, if you will. And what makes the Noah soul different than a soul than a monad on the moon, right? Or a monad
Hmm.
right in front of us on the computer or whatever. Um, the only difference there is that level of perspective. It's that level of clarity. Um, and in the same way, I mean, I like the kind of idea like imagine, you are maybe drinking alcohol or you wake up in the middle of the night randomly. That level of clarity is obviously very different than maybe when you're sober minded or active or caffeinated, in the same way that an animal monad, like my cat, right, might have a different clarity. So Deleuze is obviously showing that that perspective of the monad and the unity that you're talking about there, Reisnoza, is totally, totally on point. Okay, if people don't mind, let's just get through the next two paragraphs. And if you can see on my PDF, there's two pictures here and then one final page. So I feel like we can run this. I think it would just be nice to get this first chapter done. I'm sorry, of course, if you need to leave, feel free. But I think you can always catch up on the recording. And I'm just having a great time with this reading too. So feel free to keep talking because I also have some time today. Okay, let's do it. And I'll read these next two because the last one here is short on this page. But this is the whole problem. What happens to bodies that are destined from the semen of Adam, which envelops them, to become human bodies? Juridically, one could say that they carry the seeds of a kind of sealed act that marks their fate. And when the time comes for them to unfold their parts to attain the degree of organic development proper to man, or to form cerebral folds, their animal soul at the same time becomes reasonable by gaining a higher degree of unity, mind. The organized body would at the same time receive the disposition of the human body, and its soul would be raised to the degree of a reasonable soul. But I cannot decide here if it occurs through an ordinary process or an extraordinary work of God. Now, in any case, this becoming is an elevation and exaltation, a change of theater, of rule, of plateau, or of floor. The theater of matter gives way to that of minds or of God. In the Baroque, the soul has a complex relation with the body, always inseparable from the body. It finds in the latter an animality that makes it vertiginous, that ensnares it in the folds of matter, but also an organic or cerebral humanity, the degree of development that allows it to be elevated and will make it rise above all other folds, even if this means that the reasonable soul falls again at death and rises again at the last judgment, like a Cartesian diver. The tension is between the sinking, as Leibniz says, and the elevation or ascension that pierces the organized masses in certain places. We go from the funerary figures of the Basilica of San Lorenzo in Florence, figure 1, to the figures on the ceiling of St. Ignatius in Rome, figure 2. One might object that physical gravity and religious elevation are completely different and do not belong to the same world. Nonetheless, these are two vectors that are distributed in the distinction between the two floors of one and the same world, of one and the same house. This is because the body and the soul must indeed be inseparable, although they are nonetheless really distinct. Although they are nonetheless really distinct. We've already seen this with regard to the parts of matter. Consequently, the localization of the soul in a part of the body, no matter how small it is rather a projection from top to bottom, a projection of the soul on a point of the body in conformity with Desargues' geometry in accordance with a Baroque perspective. In short, the primary reason for an upper floor is this. There are souls on the lower floor, but some of them are called on to become reasonable and thus to change floors. Let's finish up this paragraph. Oh, it's actually not its own paragraph. It's like the next one. Okay, and we can see the pictures here. Deleuze referring to some art. And you can also get the PDF in the chat and look at them yourself. Okay, so let's take a look here. We're kind of like already making a big jump with Deleuze in my opinion here. Like he kind of started early on just talking about like that, the rudimentary forms of matter, what that means, and now we're talking about what constitutes a body, what constitutes a soul, and what it means for a soul to be reasonable. Just curious, and no rush here. If there's another reading or if we can't finish the last two paragraphs, that's fine. We can pick it up next week. But I'm just kind of curious if anyone thinks about a reasonable soul. What does that mean? What constitutes a reasonable soul? Um, is this almost I mean, I don't know if this is me being pedantic a little bit, but is this like an anthropocentrist view? Like humans are at the kind of top of the chain? Or is it, you know, is it not that? I'm just kind of curious as to what we're thinking. I mean, I don't think Deleuze at all is trying to go that route, but when he says reasonable, I mean, it kind of makes me think a little bit about something Kantian, right? Like there's a reasonable subject almost, a reasonable soul.
I I'm thinking this more in terms of, well, I guess perhaps I'm not getting too far from Kant if I think of it in these terms. So I'm thinking more in terms of synthesis, um, and unity in particular. Because he does follow this up by a comma, by gaining a higher degree of unity. It, I think that's just what becoming reasonable is here. I can't imagine another sense or it's
I totally agree. Like I think that he's just equating that reasonableness to just a higher unity. Like he is also talking about a soul moving floors, no? Like he's talking about how where does he say that? From top to bottom. So maybe it's not even fully. Yeah, here it is. There are souls on the lower floor, but some of them are called on to become reasonable and thus change floors. Is he making like a very interesting point about the evolution of humanity? Like if we talk about 500,000 years ago, whatever. Sorry, everyone. I know there's some anthropologists I think here, but I'm not fully sure. 300, 400, 500,000 years ago. Like is he talking about how humanity has evolved to become more reasonable or having a higher unity? Um, maybe. Like, is that what he means by changing the floors? Um, Bacteria evolves into these, beings that can do math or whatever, right? Like, I'm just trying to figure out here what he's talking about with that that translation from the lower to the topper floor, or that transition, I should say.
Mhm. Yeah, I suppose it's just an elevation here. That's I really do like this quote here where Leibniz says he cannot decide here if it occurs through an ordinary process or an extraordinary work of God. So at least with here, it's like he's not yet at a point to where he can say that this unity is just efficient causality working here and there um through causes which themselves do not have a higher transcendent meaning, or whether they have been organized in particular. I don't know if organized is a good word here, but just put on track, converging by by way of God, the extraordinary work of God, which sort of breaks from this more, you could say, um, this more latter ontological view. It's I mean, maybe we're just not at a point where we could say that, but the language here definitely does imply that the mind is sort of this higher, elevated state that, that we're
Oh, I mean,
moving in.
he
We're moving
says,
through.
right? I mean, he says it like you gain a higher degree of unity, right, with
Mhm.
the mind. I mean, I think what you're saying is spot on. Like when I read this paragraph, I read this as him saying that when we talk about the Noah monad or the Rhiznosa monad, that is intimately related with the body. The monad Noah kind of understands the body that composes what we call Noah more than maybe another body of an individual I've never met or seen or heard of before. Um, so the question is, sure, maybe the soul gives us that higher unity, but then what's bringing us down? And I think this is where he's trying to say that, when we're dealing with the upper and lower floor here, there's this matter. There's the body that drags the soul here, and he uses the word animality. There's this body that drags the soul, pins it down into this animality here. I think that's what he's saying. And in that process, there's almost like, no, I don't want to say tension between the lower and upper floor, but it definitely means that there's something happening in here. But it also, to me, seems almost Buddhist because is the body then a prison? Like, is the Noah monad that has a high degree of unity because I have clarity of the world. I have more clarity than our rock about the perspective of the world. Is what is holding me down my body? Is that preventing me from achieving some even higher unity? And does that sound almost like Plato now, right? Or does that almost sound um, like there must be something higher, and the highest thing is God, so we need to reach up to God, and that's I'm curious if anyone's reading that here or if or if this is just Deleuze saying like, hey, there needs to be that interrelatedness because you can't have, something outside of matter. You can only have matter and the types of forces that matter is composed of.
Yeah, there's just this inseparability that I really love, or at least I'm making sense of. Uh, it's hmm, I think I think what we're focusing on here with the floors that were lower floors, is almost mm, something. uh, It's the soul. While the soul is higher in the body, it's still localized within the body. This is perhaps also a break from Spinoza as well, because this kind of, if we speak of the soul in terms of being localized within the body, that does violate Spinoza's parallelism, which um, I'm not too sure how Leibniz fares with that, but
Yeah,
it's
Deleuze will later on, I believe, like third to last or fourth to last chapter, he will talk about that parallelism more.
mhm,
So it's very interesting that you're bringing that up here because that's what we're getting at, right? Like, what is that relationship between the body and mind? I mean, Deleuze is talking about how they are intrinsically um, interrelated. I mean, there is this sense that the soul has that clarity in a way also because of the body. Um, the reason maybe why my clarity is so clear is in this perspective of life and reality. Um, maybe that's because my body intimately relates to the world in that way. Um,
mhm,
maybe not sure, right? Maybe that's the only way that we can have clarity because how can you have it without being related to something that experiences uh, you know the forces of matter, right? Who knows? Who knows? I mean, I think we're gonna get to that for sure in the upcoming chapter or two. Um, I don't know if people want to just finish off this. It's like one page. It's literally one paragraph, or like, and then a tiny bit, so I can read it all at once. Or if you all are ready to go, but it could just be nice to get it done so that we can start chapter 2 next week. Okay, I say we just run it. Now, we cannot stop ourselves. The reciprocation of the Leibnizian principle holds not only for reasonable souls, but also for the animal or sensitive souls themselves. If two really distinct things can be inseparable, two inseparable things can be really distinct, can belong to both floors, and the localization of the one and the other can be can be simply a projection on a point. I do not think we can consider souls as being in points. Perhaps we could say that they are in a place through a correspondence. Animal souls, as degrees of unity, are thus already on the other floor, taking place mechanically in the animal itself on the lower floor. The plastic or machinic forces are part of the derivative forces that are defined in relation to the matter they organize. But souls, by contrast, are primitive forces or immaterial principles of life that are only defined from the inside, in itself, and through analogy with the mind. We cannot stop ourselves even more since these animal souls, with their reduced organism, are everywhere in inorganic matter. It is thus inorganic matter that in turn refers to souls whose local is elsewhere, more elevated, and which only project themselves on it. No doubt, a body, however small it may be, follows a curve only under the impulsion of the second kind of derivative force, the compressive or elastic forces, which determine the curve through the mechanical action of the surrounding external bodies. On its own, the body would follow the straight tangent. But here again, mechanical laws or extrinsic determinism, shock, explain everything except the unity of a concrete movement, no matter how variable or irregular it may be. Unity of movement is always an affair of the soul. almost of a consciousness, as Bergson would rediscover. Just as the totality of matter refers to a curve that is no longer determinable from the outside, the curve followed by a given body under an outside action refers to a higher unity on the other floor, an internal and individuating unity that contains the law of curvature, the law of folds or changes in direction. It is the same movement that is always determined from the outside through collisions, insofar as it is related to the derivative force, but unified from within insofar as it is related to the wait, hold on. Sorry, there's just like word salad right now. I'll restart that. It is the same movement that is always determined from the outside through collisions, insofar as it is related to the derivative force, but unified from within insofar as it is related to the primitive force. In the first relation, the curve is accidental and derived from the straight line, but in the second, it is primary. Thus, the spring is sometimes explained mechanically through the action of subtle surroundings, and sometimes is comprehended from within as the interior of the body, the cause of the motion that is already in the body, and which expects from the outside only the suppression of an obstacle. And then leading into the last short paragraph, the necessity of another floor is thus affirmed everywhere and is properly metaphysical. It is the soul itself that constitutes the other floor, or the interiority of the upper floor, where there is no window for external influences. Even for physics, we pass from extrinsic material folds to animated internal folds, spontaneous folds. These are what we must now examine in their nature and in their unfoldings. Everything happens as if the folds of matter did not have their reason in themselves. This is because the fold is always between two folds, and because this between two folds seems to take place everywhere. But is it between inorganic bodies and organisms? Between organisms and animal souls? Between animal souls and reasonable souls? Between souls and bodies in general? Question mark. And we have concluded chapter 1. Really quick, wanted to point out with the 31st footnote, Deleuze cites Guéraud. He says he cites Guéraud here. He says Guéraud has shown how external determinism and internal spontaneity are already perfectly reconciled in respect to physical bodies. Quote, elasticity is now considered as the expression of the first spontaneity of the active primitive force. End quote. Okay. A lot seems to be happening here, but in a way, I think in a way, this is also giving a summary too. I think that Deleuze's writing here, even though, I mean, he writes in a very dense manner, I do think that when we're kind of reading it like this, to me it reads as though he's giving a summary while also kind of showing how he wants to move on from this. What we see in these last two paragraphs is the complete culmination of everything we have discussed relating to what matter is, specifically talking about the different forces in matter, how matter pertains to foldings, infinite foldings and unfoldings, and how this sort of internal-external dichotomy is an arbitrary one, but also sort of important to look at the internal milieu of an organism and the external milieu of the inorganic. However, what makes this part to me incredibly more unique is that he's really getting into, I think, kind of what Reisnoza was getting at, almost like the parallelism stuff that we see in Spinoza. How does the soul fundamentally relate to the body? And when Deleuze is specifically, where is it? When he's specifically talking about, towards the end here, he's talking about curvatures, straight lines, tangents. We have to kind of remember here, earlier on, last week, we were discussing how the universe is this infinite curve, and that's how he's conceptualizing it, at least. and how that infinite curve is also understood via inflections. So when we look at an inflection, and I can also kind of paste just like a quick picture. Here we go. And I think what he's sort of getting at here, and someone can also correct me if I'm wrong, is he's trying to understand how we can look at the relationship between the soul and a body in almost a way of parallelism. Is it purely that the body is doing this like a pure machine, like a extrinsic determinism? A causes B, B causes C, C causes D, etc. And then is that then what the soul kind of consumes and sees, and that's now the soul? Or does the soul have this sort of a priori relationship that guides the body? I think that's what he's trying to get at here. So he's talking about on one level of the relation, you can kind of see how the curve is, quote, accidental and derived from a straight line, but in the second, it is primary. So for me, when I see this, I think what he's trying to get at is not a strict determinism, but also not something that's fully indeterminate. And I'm wondering kind of what that looks like. If we look at this quote here, and specifically, it looks like he's quoting Leibniz again. It's the cause of motion that is already in the body, and which expects from the outside only the suppression of an obstacle. So it's not like the body is like a race car that you pull back and let go, even though to an extent it is, because there's already motion there via the foldings. So it's not fully mechanical, but it also is kind of having, it has this internal force that responds to obstacles that are external to it. And I think this is almost sort of also getting at free will. Does the soul determine the body, vice versa? Do they remain fully parallel to each other? I'm not sure if anyone else is reading like that similarly. Um, I'm not sure. I mean, this is obviously kind of attacking a bit of the Cartesian model um, of matter, as we saw earlier. And to bring it back to the inflection points, that's how the curve is itself changing in terms of whether it's concave or not, or how that is. So when we're looking at the body, for example, it's not purely determinate straight line from point A to point B, but rather always existing on this curvature. And the perspective here matters as well. Um, I don't know if anyone here sees this here. It says unity of movement is always an affair of the soul, almost of a consciousness, as Bergson would rediscover. So to me, he's very much saying, when we look at something such as I ran a marathon from point A to point B, how are we able to conceptualize that as a fluid course or a fluid movement? And he says that it looks like that's the matter of the soul. So we're going to kind of see here, how I think he's talking about it, because I don't think he's being the most clear, but I think towards the end, this is where he kind of affirms where we're moving on. He's clearly saying that regardless of whether we look at things like movement or matter, motion, there is still that relationship between the soul floor, the higher floor of clarity, maybe unity, and then the lower floor of the inorganic matter, maybe some animal souls, for example. So the last question is exactly what we're going to be sort of dealing with. If we know that the fold is between two folds, always folding and unfolding, then does that mean then that when we look at reality, are we dealing with a fold only being between inorganic bodies and organisms, organisms and animal souls and reasonable souls, or just souls and bodies as a general thing. So is reality only folding and unfolding in relation then to the two different kinds of matter, or between, certain souls and animals or whatever? And that's what we're slowly going to be, you know, uh, I guess, diving into later. Um, I really appreciate everyone for coming. I did see Patina writing. Just saying, feel free to jump in. And then yeah, Rise knows what were you gonna say here? Sorry, my cat is like scratching. Um, but yeah, Rise knows. I feel like you're gonna say something. Maybe Rise knows cut out. I know Rise knows. I said earlier that their internet or power, or your mic isn't working. Bummer. Um, yeah. Okay. Let's see. Reznoza wrote. Wait, my mic isn't working. And then wrote, I was going to point out the usage of really distinct earlier in the paragraph that we read here.
No?
Oh, it's working now. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. All right, cool. Uh, yeah, I was looking at the way you use really distinct because it's really interesting here. Um, it, I think he's alluding or working with Duns Scotus distinction between real distinction and formal distinction, which employs quite frequently when discussing Spinoza. It's and typically when we think of real distinction, we think of it between things which are maybe substantially distinct, or so distinct to where they um, their distinction it can't be for example, it can't be a distinction in quantity or number because that presupposes some abstract link or linkage or commonality between these things. They make up some similar substance, but no, these things are substantially distinct. And typically, when we speak of these things, at least if we go through classical Spinozist thinking, then we'll see that they are wholly unique and can't interact. But but for this Leibnizian metaphysic here, we speak of them as inseparable and in fact engaged in these interactions, which is really interesting to me because once again this is the floor. These are the floors, the two floors in which the souls pass to this reasonable uh, elevation. I would say it's how does that interaction happen is what I'm wondering here, and I'm curious as to what it. I think that's really the whole question here that we've been asking, but I'm not sure if it's resolved in this paragraph or not really, or at least not sufficiently. Um, I think it's just he's trying to say that through the soul providing unity, um, or at least being this, attaining this unity towards. Uh, I'm perhaps that's the extent to which this inseparability goes, but I I just wanted to point that out because I think it's really helpful to acknowledge that.
Yeah, I think that it's so funny that you're pointing this out because, like, now that I'm looking back at the rest of the paragraph, I'm thinking to myself, like, this to me is a big crux of it all. I mean, he's talked about the reciprocation of Leibnizian principle holds that not only for reasonable souls but also for animal or sensitive souls. So in the same way that an animal, even though they might not have as much clarity, there is still this level of clarity, right, in relation to the body as well. So yeah, when he says if two really distinct things can be inseparable, such as the soul and the body, then that means two inseparable things can also be very, very distinct. And it says can belong to both floors. So yeah, we do see this weird, and this is where I think he's ending here. It's like we're seeing that translation, uh, between the lower and upper floor and how they're not fully distinct, right? They're not fully separated. So then what is that relationship? And when you really look at that even broader, when we're looking at all of reality, the universe, whatever, when we're looking at that entire process of folding, is that folding always just in relation to soul versus non-soul? Like, are we kind of flirting with Cartesian principle, like mind versus body here? And we're going to really get to that. And I think that he has a good foundation in this first paragraph. And then Patina is cooking, absolute heat. I can see it. Patina wrote, definitely feels like a recapitulation of his use of there being these two heterogenetic series that converge together to some paradoxical element and then diverge after. And that makes the two series distinct but inseparable through this fold or like the inflection point. But the inflection point is like the perspective of this paradoxical elements from of the element from the side of matter, while it becomes enclosed in a unity, and inclusion from the perspective of the soul on this paradoxical thing that is somehow causing the two floors to resonate and be related, but not through homogeneous measure or common thing that relates the two. But I'm not entirely sure how that works. That this reminds me of logic of sense. Um, I read parts of Logic and Sense, so I can't comment. Um, I could see that because obviously this is like Deleuze is like one of his last final full books, right, where he's writing. So I could see him drawing from it because he draws a lot from Logic of Sense. But given your point here, I think that this is such an interesting point. Is that there's these two heterogenetic series that are fully distinct in their own way, but then through the event in Deleuze, or through, I guess I'll just say the event, through the event in Deleuze, they somehow have that interaction, and through that, it produces something, right? And that's what you're saying, Bettina. That those heterogenetic series emerge, interrelate, produce something, and then also diverge. Um, so it's almost like we're still dealing with the same overall curvature, but at the same time, we're also dealing with there being particular distinctions and interrelatedness between two different kinds of series. So when you're saying that, it's also making me think about look at the soul, like the soul monad versus the body, how for a moment in time there is this patina monad and the body that constitutes what we call patina um, that interact. And then when Patina's body eventually decomposes, like everyone's, that monad that is Patina is still there. It just doesn't have as much clarity anymore. And then it can go in between the floors. It might go back to the lower floor and then might go back up to the upper floor. And to me, that's how I'm kind of reading inflection here. Totally, I'm
That's
sorry if I'm butchering what you're saying, but I actually really do like that idea of almost this like paradoxical thing here. Um,
mhm.
to me,
That's
it's quite smart.
really interesting here, actually. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, no,
uh,
yeah. What were you gonna say?
just because it's just what this is making me think of here is that um, and when you say that the soul sort of loses some of its clarity without the body or without anything of which it could provide unity to, I'm just thinking too when Spinoza speaks of the soul, for instance, um, or as because Spinoza, contrary to a lot of popular belief, does actually have a conception of the soul that does persist beyond the body, which sounds like it would be contradictory to his parallelism. But if you read ethics, and you can see the logic coming together. Um, but but the thing is though, it's not really affected by um by either the body or of any um, any anything in extensity of which here with Leibniz would say provide unity to. It isn't affected by that. In fact, it both proceeds and continues beyond as an essence,
Mhm.
such. And so when Leibniz when we're speaking about Leibniz and we say that the soul almost loses some bit of clarity here, I think about the distinction between how Spinoza and Leibniz think about essences, right? Um, if I recall in another Deleuze text I read, it was it's later in Deleuze's life. It was titled Spinoza and the Three Ethics. I believe he mentioned Leibnizian essences as this tendency to exist. I don't, um, which just isn't really a thing, Spinoza here. And but if Spinoza is understanding the soul in the same sense, it's like the essence of the mind itself, which is going to be under the aspect of eternity, um, then hmm, perhaps this distinction here manifest in what we're talking about with the soul, and once again displays some sort of interaction between these really distinct layers. I don't know if what I'm saying is the most coherent because once again I'm not the most well read with Leibniz, so I'm my terminology is just a bit kind of all over the place.
Yeah,
But
I mean, you have a
uh,
picture of
yeah,
Spinoza as your profile picture, and
that is true.
you renamed yourself Rise Noza, right?
Such
And I'm sure there's probably something in your bio, I'm sure about it. But look, the
there
reality
is.
is everything you're saying is on point, right? Like when Deleuze, I mean, this is coming after Deleuze has theorized a ton about Spinoza. So Deleuze has already dealt with the parallelism question between the mind and the body. And now I totally see what you're saying here. It's like he's doing something similar, right? He's doing something similar with Leibniz. And that's the question that's, in my opinion, here at the basis of reality. You have the two floors, the upper and the lower floor. The, organic, the organic matter, their soul, for example, has that utmost clarity at the upper floor. The monad of a rock is probably at the lower floor, right? And how these two things are interrelating, communicating with each other, how that produces reality is going to be, I mean, that's always been Deleuze's entire project, the conditions of real experience. His transcendental empiricism, his, the three syntheses in BWO, whatever we're talking about, we're trying to get at how reality is continuously produced. What is it? What does that look like? What is that process? And that's why I think this last sentence here is key when we're dealing with the process of folding, such as that infinite piece of origami paper that we fold an infinite number of times and unfold to express reality. He's trying to get at what is the, if every fold is between two folds, what is that? Are we dealing with something that's, a piece of paper that is half organic and half inorganic? Are we dealing with a piece of paper that's, where we're relating between organisms and animal souls, or what are we trying to look at here with this, with this production of reality, and how does that folding, process take place? So um, the good news is chapter 2, it looks like it's titled The Folds in the Soul, whereas this chapter was titled The Folds of Matter. So I have a feeling as we move forward next week into chapter 2, we'll probably get some clear answers to it. I will say though, it is getting late, and didn't mean to cut anyone off if anyone wants to say anything, but I do appreciate everyone joining the reading, and please show up next week so we can start chapter 2 of Deleuze's The Fold and solve the individuation problem.